Ah, my dear viewer, are you ready to take a journey through time? Today I'm going to take you to the heart of history, among England's misty forests, cobbled roads, and centuries-old castles. The year 1199. In England, one of the most powerful kingdoms in Europe, the shadow of a king on the throne was slowly darkening. This was no ordinary monarch. History would know him for his territorial losses, endless wars and decisions that had caused hardship for his people. His name was King John. His nickname was Homeless. But have you ever wondered why a king is called stateless? We will discover together how deep conflicts and events are hidden behind this title. This is the story not only of the fall of a king, but also of a nation's quest for freedom and a document that changed the course of history, the Magna Carta. It is a document that resonates even today in the foundations of modern law. Now take a deep breath, because as we move through the mists, we will witness one of the turning points not only of King John, but also of the history of England. If you are ready, the story begins. Chapter 5, the closing chapter of this series. Its title is of no moment to us. Ah, my dear friends, this time I will take you back in time to a dark, dark era. The year is 1199. In the lands of Europe echoing with the cries of war, England's throne was empty and the throne room was silent. Richard the Lionheart, King of England, had been mortally wounded during a siege in France and had died. This was not only the death of a king, it was also the end of an era, the moment when Britain's destiny began to change. With Richard's death, the question of the heir to the throne was on everyone's lips. As the nobles, churchmen, and commoners of the kingdom searched for the answer to this question, a restlessness was growing within them. It was at this point that Richard's younger brother John appeared on the scene. John had been nicknamed the Stateless since he was a child, because his older brothers had left him no land when they divided the family inheritance between them. But fortune was on his side now. When Richard died, John was the strongest candidate for the throne. When he ascended the throne, John aroused mixed feelings among both commoners and nobles. Unlike Richard, John was known neither as a great warrior nor as a lover of his people. On the contrary, he was whispered to be a little sneaky, a little opportunistic, and a little too ambitious. But sometimes the throne would fall into the hands of those who seemed the weakest and show their true colors. John's early moves further complicated England's complex political situation at the time. England was a kingdom constantly at war to protect its European territories. Normandy in particular was an area frequently invaded by France. With John's accession to the throne, the direction of this war began to change. John was not a strong enough military leader and made many mistakes in diplomacy. This has created unrest both at home and abroad. John's style of governance soon put a heavy burden on the people. High taxes fell like a mountain on the shoulders of the people. The nobles were uncomfortable with John's arbitrary decisions. He believed that fear was the only force that could keep him on the throne, so he tried to assert his authority by harsh means. Whispers spread among the people. This king thinks only of his own interests. He is not a leader who listens to his people. But John's harsh style of rule did not only increase domestic unrest. His relations with France also worsened. The risk of losing Normandy was growing. John's policies and errors of judgment were multiplying his enemies both at home and abroad. But this was only the beginning. Under this dark shadow of the throne, no one could quite see that England was drifting towards a historic turning point. At this point, my dear friends, I leave you with the question, how would this unrest under John's rule lead England to its end? Were John's mistakes big enough to change the course of history? Let's look for the answers to these questions together in the next chapter. My dear friends, let us now step into a dark turning point in history. The year 1204. The years of John the Patriot, King of England, were a time of turmoil for this beautiful land, both at home and abroad. From his first day on the throne, John tried to rewrite England's destiny. But things were not going to go as he had planned. One of King John's biggest problems was his struggle with King Philippe Auguste of France. France wanted to reclaim the ancestral lands of the Norman kings of England. These lands, starting with the Duchy of Normandy, were Britain's most valuable assets on the European continent. Normandy was not only a strategic stronghold, but also a symbol of Britain's prestige. But John has increasingly jeopardized this prestige with his policies and military moves. The conflicts that began in 1202 were further complicated by John's inept leadership. While Philippe Auguste stepped up his campaign to seize Normandy, John struggled to quell domestic unrest. Unfortunately, John was a leader devoid of diplomacy. Instead of making concessions to his enemies, he stubbornly pursued his own course, losing allies and strengthening enemies. As the French armies advanced deeper into Normandy, the English troops retreated helplessly, and finally in 1204, Normandy was completely out of English control. The loss of Normandy was not just the loss of a territory. It was the most tangible sign of the weakness of John's reign. England's influence in Europe had been shaken, and its decline vis-à-vis France made clear. The barons and nobles were outraged by these losses. How could a legacy like Normandy fall so easily into the hands of the enemy, they asked. John's tax policies had already hit the people hard, and this great loss was both an economic and an emotional blow. The people believed that the king was unable to defend them, and the barons were becoming increasingly dissatisfied with John's weak leadership. Do you think King John understood the consequences of these losses? Of course he did, but instead of leading him to win the support of his people, his understanding led him to a more authoritarian style of rule. Instead of winning the loyalty of the nobles, he chose to repress them. This was a fatal mistake for a monarch, because John's authority was based on the support of the barons and the people. But now the barons were whispering among themselves, trying to summon the courage to confront the king. My dear friends, the collapse that began with the loss of Normandy was only the beginning. But how would John's weakness upset the internal balance of England? What fate would the barons' anger lead him to? Let's explore the answers to these questions together in the next episode. My dear friends, let us regroup and step back into a turbulent period of history. By 1212, the land of England was like the mouth of a volcano. Unrest was growing, patience was fraying, and an eruption was imminent. What was the reason for this? It was, of course, King John's cruel and reckless policies of rule. John's loss of valuable lands like Normandy had already hurt the barons' pride. But not only that, the king decided to collect more taxes from the people and the barons to make up for his weak leadership. Like stones being carried to the top of a mountain, these taxes became heavier and heavier. crushing the people and the barons. John argued that these taxes were merely an economic necessity, but the reality was that these resources were mostly used to finance the king's failed military campaigns. Not even enough to patch the holes in the royal treasury. John's unjust practices were not limited to taxes. The royal courts functioned at the king's whim, and justice became a commodity that could be bought with money. His decisions on land ownership particularly enraged the barons. He usurped their inheritance rights and filled his own treasury with fines and debts. The barons could no longer tolerate John's arbitrary and tyrannical behavior. In such an atmosphere, the barons whispered among themselves for the first time. "We cannot put up with this," they said. "Our king is not acting like a ruler, but like a tyrant. The glorious history of this land cannot accept such rule." These whispers gradually sowed the seeds of a plan. The barons decided to unite against John. Each acted out of concern for the security of its own territory, but at the same time knew that uniting against a common enemy was inevitable. In 1212, the barons had had enough. They moved to make clear their demands to John. But this was no easy task. John, though seemingly weak, was still on the throne and ready to confront the barons with his troops. The barons feared the king's wrath, but what fueled their anger was that their own people and honor were at stake. So they appeared before the king with a carefully crafted message. Their demands were clear: lower taxes, restoration of justice, and limitation of royal powers. But John ignored these demands and underestimated the barons' courage. By 1215, patience had run out. The unification of the barons was no longer a dream, but a reality. They raised their own banners, gathered their armies, and launched an open revolt against John. Even important cities like London began to side with the barons. John was left alone at this point, engaged in a painful struggle to keep his throne. But at the end of this rebellion, would the barons be able to get their demands accepted? How would a document that would go down in history as Magna Carta change the fate of England? Let's discover the answers to these questions together in the next chapter. Ah, my friends, now listen to me carefully. That deep river we call history sometimes overflows in great waves and can change the destiny of a nation in an instant. The Battle of Bouvines in 1214 was one such wave. King John of England had dreams. He wanted to regain his lands, bring the French king to his knees, and strengthen his throne. But history has written a story where he faced harsh realities, not his dreams. In those days, the European throne disputes were being resolved not only in the palaces of the kings, but also on the vast battlefields. King John wanted to make up for the loss of Normandy and regain his lost prestige in France. To do this, he devised a plan. He would build a coalition against King Philippe II of France and create one of the most powerful armies in Western Europe. John chose his allies carefully, attracting powerful figures such as the Count of Flanders and the German Emperor Otto. But as fate would have it, it wasn't just swords and spears on the battlefields, but intelligence and leadership. And this time, John's plans crumbled in the face of France's more decisive leadership. The Battle of Bouvines took place on a hot summer day. Both sides expected to win, but while the French king's army led the battle in a disciplined manner, there was dissent and chaos within John's coalition. King John's lack of leadership led to a breakdown in coordination between his allies. The French knew how to exploit this weakness and turned the war in their favor. The result was devastating for John. At the end of the war, Britain's disappointment echoed as loudly as France's cries of victory. In virtually This defeat opened deep wounds in England. Economic resources were depleted, army morale was shattered, and the people were angry at the king's failures. The barons no longer hid their long-building discontent with John. Louvain was not just a defeat on the battlefield, it had also upset the political balance within England. The barons began to use this defeat as leverage against John's leadership. They began to ask, if a king cannot protect his own country, does he have the right to sit on the throne? Under these circumstances, John's weakening authority paved the way for the unification and strengthening of the barons. Supported by the people, the barons openly challenged John's tyranny and failed policies. The Battle of Bouvigny was a turning point in England's history. Defeat on the battlefield paved the way for the drafting of the Magna Carta. The people and the nobles sought an order that would limit the king's powers. This was to be not just a document, but a contract on the future of the kingdom. But how did this contract come about? And how did John respond to these demands? Here's where the intrigue really begins. Why don't we discover the story of the painful birth of the Magna Carta together? This great struggle between the king and the barons remains an unforgettable chapter in history. My friends, now listen to me carefully. This is the story of a time of great change in the land of England, when kings were torn between the power of kings and the courage of barons. The year was 1215. The sweet breezes of spring mingled with the harsh winds of unrest within the kingdom. King John thought he ruled by the might of the throne, but the barons' patience was running out. No longer content with rumors or secret agreements, they shouted their demands directly to the king's face. The barons were tired of paying for years of heavy taxes, arbitrary decisions, and endless wars. John's defeats in France had depleted the country's resources and increased the pressure on the commoners and nobles. For the barons, this was now a matter of pride. They joined forces and banded together to stand up to the king. Their demands were clear. The king's powers were to be limited, and his rights were to be guaranteed by a written document. "Spend my time on the stage," John wrote. They finally told him. This document would become Magna Carta, one of the most famous contracts in history. In the spring, amidst the greenery that covered the lands of England, the barons were moving with great determination. They did not hesitate to raise armies to show their power. They marched as far as London, pressing the king to listen to them. This was resistance not only from the barons, but also from a wide cross-section of society, including merchants, farmers, and the church. There was unrest against John's authority at all levels of society. King John was initially angry and stubborn about these demands. He felt that his authority as God's representative on earth could not be questioned. But when he saw the united force against him and the waning support even in his own court, he was forced to agree to sit down at the negotiating table with the barons. But my friends, these negotiations were not easy. Both sides took a tough stance to protect their own interests. The barons were determined to win their rights, while John was determined not to compromise his own royal authority. This conflict was not only about the debates and negotiations, it was also a tension in the shadow of swords. In the face of united pressure from the barons, John chose to resist further to buy time. However, the barons' demands were clear and unambiguous. Magna Carta had to be signed immediately. This was more than just signing a document. It was one of the first steps in limiting the divine rights of the king and recognizing the rights of a nation. In writing. But would John really submit? Or would this conflict grow to the point of triggering a civil war? The answer to this question will mark an unforgettable turning point in history. Are you ready to learn about the famous signing of the Magna Carta and how it opened the door to a new era? Let's discover the rest of this extraordinary story together. My friends, sit beside me and I will tell you a story whose every word comes from the deepest traces of history. It is that famous month of June, 1215. The dark clouds over England seem to have finally reached a crossroads. The determination of the barons and the stubbornness of King John were finally paving the way for a treaty to be born. But this was too complex a matter to be resolved with a mere drop of ink. It was at such a time that the Magna Carta, the Great Edict, was born. On those days, the barons and the king's representatives met on the peaceful banks of the Thames, on the famous plain called Runnymede. But don't imagine this meeting as a peaceful assembly of friends. No, on the contrary, there was distrust and anger in the hearts of both sides. The barons were determined to end years of arbitrary rule, heavy taxes and injustice. King John knew that these demands were a threat to his authority, but my friends, John no longer had much leverage. He had already lost the support of the people and was helpless against the combined power of the barons. And the judge's sentence was immediate. The writing of the Magna Carta was itself a battle of diplomacy. The barons worked with wise jurists and scribes to put down on paper the demands they had been building up for a long time. They had to be the voice not only of the barons, but also of the church and the people. One of the first articles added to the document guaranteed the freedom of the church. John had previously clashed with the papacy and tried to control the church. Now, the independence of the church was written down in Magna Carta. This was a great gain not only for the barons, but also for the clergy. Other articles of the edict made it clear that feudal rights were to be protected and that the king could not violate them. For years, the barons had been fed up with the king's unquestioning use of their lands and serfs. Now Magna Carta limited the king's powers over feudal rights. It also included legal reforms. Arbitrary arrests were to be made equal and accessible to all. The barons wanted to put an end to justice being shaped solely according to the king's whim. Each item was documented after much debate and contention. The great tents pitched at Runnymede were silent witnesses to these heated negotiations. Every word, every sentence was debated, and the interests of both the king and the barons were taken into account. This process took days, but in the end, all parties made enough progress to shape the document. But was this great compromise really meant to last? Or was Magna Carta only a symbol of a temporary peace? Would King John really be true to what was written in this document? My friends, you must continue to follow our story together to find out. My friends, here we are at that turning point in history. The year is 1215. The day is June 15th. The sky was blue with a wisdom, as if it knew it was about to witness history. On the peaceful banks of the River Thames, on the quiet plain called Runnymede, a tense waiting reigned. Facing each other, the confronting parties studied each other. No one could predict exactly how this moment would echo in the pages of the future. But today a step was to be taken that would change the face of history. King John came to Runnymede, bowing to the barons' demands. But remember, my friends, this was not a situation he accepted cheerfully. Reluctance and bitterness were plain to see on his face. The combined power of the barons and the loss of popular support had forced him to this meeting. He wanted to protect his throne, and keep his kingdom on the brink of civil war. But let me tell you, somewhere inside John, there was a sneaking suspicion that once he had signed this treaty, he would break his promises. Ah, what an irony. It was in such a mood that one of the most important documents of history was to be signed. The barons were determined. After days of negotiations, Magna Carta came to life on parchment. For them, this document was not only an expression of their rights, but also a victory over the arbitrary rule of the king. The crowd gathered at Runnymede that day was in a state of quiet excitement. Lords and barons on one side, the king's allies and advisors on the other. They all felt the weight of this historic moment. And finally, King John pulled the scroll in front of him. With trembling hands, he grasped the pen, and after a long hesitation, he signed his name. At that moment, a gentle breeze blew over Runnymede, as if even history itself breathed a sigh of relief. The signing of the Magna Carta was not just a royal edict, it was a turning point, showing that the king's power could be limited and that the rights of the people could be protected in writing. The struggle between the barons and the king seemed to be crowned with the victory of law and justice. Magna Carta was a roadmap that would shape the future of England. It included reforms on the independence of the church, the protection of feudal rights, and the need for equal justice for all. But more than that, this document laid the foundations of modern constitutional systems. Just imagine, my friends, a scroll signed that day would centuries later become the defender of democracy and individual rights. But oh, my dear friends, after this great victory, dark clouds began to gather in the sky. King John proclaimed his acceptance of Magna Carta to the world, but deep down he was plotting how to break the treaty. But would the barons and the people realize the king's insidious intentions? And would the Magna Carta continue to shine as a beacon of hope? To find out the answers to these questions, we must sail together to the next chapter of our story. Ah, my dear friends, we will now dive between the lines of that very important parchment, the Magna Carta. This document, signed at Runnymede, was not just an agreement between the barons of the time and King John. It was a manifesto that planted the first seeds of justice and the rule of law. That scroll became one of the most important documents in history. But what was so unique about those words? Let's take a look together. First, the rights of the barons. Ah, the barons. For centuries, they had been oppressed under the arbitrary rule of the king. One day they had to pay high taxes as the king demanded. The next day they lived in fear that their estates would be confiscated. But the Magna Carta put an end to their helplessness. Among the articles, it was clearly stated that the king could no longer arbitrarily confiscate the property or estates of any baron. Moreover, the taxes to be levied on the barons would no longer depend on the king's will, but on a kind of collective consent. This meant not only a fiscal adjustment, but also a severe limitation of the king's absolute power. The limits on taxation were one of the most radical innovations of the period. Imagine a system in which a king could not collect money from the people at will. This was a reassurance for the barons, but it was also a beacon of hope for the people across England. The king could no longer arbitrarily finance wars or empty his treasury. In this sense, Magna Carta was not only a document, but also a guide that redefined the king's relationship with his people. The rule of law. Ah, my friends, here is the most important principle that engraved Magna Carta in the golden pages of history. With this document, it was clearly declared that even the king was not above the law. Imagine where once the king's word had been absolute law, now a legal system was being defined to which he too must be held accountable. This was a revolution for the barons as well as for the common people. No one would be imprisoned without cause. No one would be punished without trial. This article would leave a legacy to future generations as the cornerstone of modern legal systems. Of course, the freedoms for the church and the people should not be forgotten. Magna Carta emphasized that the church should not be under the pressure of the state. At that time, the church was the people's greatest refuge against the power of the king. However, this refuge was also threatened by the king's interventions. This document laid the foundations of freedom of belief by granting independence to the church. For perhaps the first time, the people could breathe in the shadow of the king. Although the Magna Carta offered limited freedoms for the people, it was a beginning. That scroll would open the door to greater rights in centuries to come. But, my dear friends, could these impressive articles of Magna Carta really be implemented? Would King John stick to them, or would he try to make the scroll forgotten? The answers to these questions are hidden in the next part of our story. Are you ready? In the autumn of 1215, the winds of hope brought by the Magna Carta were dimmed by the stubbornness and ambition of King John. Imagine that even before the ink had dried on that great treaty with the barons, John had found a way to repudiate the document that subjugated his will. It was a betrayal that played not only with its own people, but with the balance of power across Europe. John never believed in the binding force of Magna Carta. While he smiled faintly at the barons he met at Runnymede, he was actually growing in his hatred for them. Even though he seemed to accept the terms of the treaty, he had other plans in his head. These barons may have backed me into a corner, I could sense him thinking, but I will find a way to regain my power as a king. It was with these thoughts that he turned to Pope Innocentius III, who believed in the absolute authority of kings and considered such a document dangerous. Getting the Pope's support was one of the turning points in John's destiny. The Pope called Magna Carta an affront to divine authority and declared the document invalid. This was a complete betrayal for the barons. The fact that the Pope, a neutral arbiter of the treaty, sided with John angered the barons and their supporters. The king had become a leader who had turned his back not only on the barons, but also on the concept of justice of the time. Learning of King John's betrayal, the barons did not remain silent this time. The dark shadows of civil war began to fall over England once again. It was a period of chaos that historians call the First Barons' War. The barons took up arms to defend their rights. They mobilized allies across England to rally their forces and even sought support from France. John was determined to crush the uprising with his loyal soldiers and mercenaries. The Civil War was a time of bloodshed, burning villages and deep suffering for the people. The barons challenged the royal authority by seizing London, while John resorted to cruel methods to reassert his own authority. Cities were besieged, castles fell, and the land of England was shifting back and forth between the two sides like a chessboard. These conflicts were not only a political struggle, but also a people's resistance to achieve their dreams of justice and freedom. But as the Civil War continued, fate would play an unexpected trick on King John. In the midst of this chaos, how long would the barons and the people hold out? Would John's fall end this chaotic war? Or would England be plunged into even deeper darkness? The answers to these questions are hidden in the next chapter of history. If you're ready, let's meet in the next episode. My dear friends, I will now take you into the flames of a years-long struggle on English soil. After King John's betrayal of the Magna Carta, a deep wave of anger swept the country. The barons could not remain silent in the face of this great betrayal. Magna Carta was not just a piece of parchment, but a landmark for their honor, their rights, and the future of the people. But unfortunately, these rights would have to be defended, not in peace, but in blood and tears. From the fall of 1215, barons across England took up arms. Each of them believed that the Magna Carta should not just remain on paper, but should be engraved in life itself. It was not an easy fight, for John was ready to use any trick to protect his throne and strengthen his authority. With his loyal soldiers and mercenaries, he was determined to once again bloody the battlefields. This war opened deep rifts not only between the royalty and the barons, but also at the heart of English society. The country was divided into those who supported the barons and those who remained loyal to King John. Cities, villages, and even families were torn apart by this struggle. From the bottom to the top of society, everyone became a part of this war. While the fighting raged on the city walls, in the village squares, people debated which side to take. But there was one thing everyone knew. This war would end not only with the victory of one power, but with the reshaping of the destiny of a nation. London became one of the most important theaters of this conflict. The barons captured the capital and won a great victory against the crown. But this victory was not enough to end the war. King John rallied his troops and launched a counterattack. Every corner of England, from east to west, north to south, bore the scars of this war. Burned villages, plundered fields, and ruined castles clearly showed how devastating the war had been. The prolongation of the war caused not only physical destruction, but also deep wounds in the psyche of the society. The people were tired of years of conflict and thirsted for peace. But neither the barons nor King John were willing to back down. Both sides were determined to go all the way in their favor. Would the barons' anger and John's stubbornness plunge England deeper into chaos? Or would the light of peace once again shine through the dark clouds of war? The answer to these questions is hidden in the next chapter. If you are ready, let's continue. My friends, now I will tell you the story of the end of an era of darkness and the beginning of a new age of hope. With the smoke of the battlefields still hanging over the land, and destruction and despair reigning across England, fate knocked on King John's door. In the fall of 1216, after a hard life, this stubborn king finally breathed his last. Rumor has it that John's death was caused by a battle wound or a serious illness, but some say it was his greed and ambition that haunted him all his life. M.E. and Lord de Nansen on Council of State develops an intelligence report on the death of John Raymond. John's death radically changed the fate of the endless war between the barons and the kingdom. The chaos that had long reigned in the country gave way, if only for a moment, to a profound silence. That night, they say, the stars shone differently, as if the gloomy clouds hanging over England were slowly beginning to dissipate. But behind this silence was a nation searching for answers to a new question. What now? How would Britain get out of this chaos? King John had left the throne to his son Henry, a young and inexperienced heir. This little boy, only 9 years old, was declared the new heir to the throne. Ironically, The accession of an infant king was to be a turning point for England. The accession of young Henry III heralded not only a new monarch, but a new era. Because Henry's young age led to the introduction of a group of wise statesmen and barons who would actually rule the country, this meant that an authoritarian monarch was replaced by a more balanced approach to governance. The barons rallied around the petty king and under his guidance set about rebuilding England. The first step was to end the war. They knew that more bloodshed would do no one any good. Gradually, peace began to prevail between the barons and the crown. Magna Carta was revived, but this time with more care and caution. Henry's advisors recognized the importance of the document and began to see it as a tool that would become the foundation of England in the future. For the people of England, this new era meant a great deal. The exhaustion of years of war was giving way to peace and reconstruction. But this was not going to be an easy process. The government shaped around a young king had to make difficult decisions. Britain's resurgence required not only a strong government, but also the trust and loyalty of the people. But would this little king be able to bear the heavy burden? Could Henry III save England from his father's dark legacy and lead England into a new age? These questions will be answered in the next act of history. Now, I invite you to discover how this hopeful beginning turned into a story. My friends, I will now tell you the story of that pivotal year. Imagine that after many years of turmoil and civil war, England finally had hope of peace. By 1217, the war weariness that had spread across the country had made people more eager for peace. Both the royalty and the barons had finally realized that further bloodshed was pointless. It was precisely with these feelings that the great compromise that went down in history as the Treaty of Lambeth came to the table. As the parties met that day in Lambeth, their deep distrust of each other could easily be read on their faces. The crown was unwilling to compromise its authority by accepting the barons' demands. The barons had not forgotten King John's legacy of deceit and deception. But the young king, Henry III, and his advisors realized that the only way to put these disputes behind them was to find a compromise through mutual concessions. Those around the king knew that peace was essential if the young monarch was to consolidate his throne and win the confidence of the people. The barons now saw that continuing the war would have a devastating effect on their lands and peoples. The negotiations for the Treaty of Lambeth were long and difficult. In the end, however, the parties managed to reach a compromise. The barons agreed to recognize the king's authority, but in exchange for the reaffirmation of Magna Carta. Magna Carta was no longer just a document, but a foundation that shaped the future of England. This document, which had previously been betrayed by King John, was brought back to the agenda at the insistence of the barons in a way that would take a permanent place in history. King Henry III and his advisors ratified Magna Carta, but with minor amendments. Some clauses that would weaken royal authority were removed, yet the essence of the document, the rule of law and the protection of individual rights, remained intact. This treaty not only brought about a reconciliation between the barons and the king, but also offered new hope to the people of England. As the people began to recover from the wounds of the war, they began to believe that law was something beyond the arbitrary rule of a king. Magna Carta became a guarantee for both the barons and the people, and that document became a manifesto for justice that resonates deep in the history of England. The Treaty of Lambeth not only brought an end to the wars, but also enshrined the Magna Carta as a permanent document. It would later become one of the cornerstones of English law. The long journey from the birth of Parliament to modern democracies was reshaped here in Lambeth. But what impact would Magna Carta have in this new era? Could it really bring about a lasting change in the governance of England and the protection of the rights of the people? We will find the answers to these questions in the next pages of history, my dear friends. Come on, get ready for the next story, because the shadow of Magna Carta will affect a much wider world. Ah, my friends, now I am going to take you on a journey that will last for years, even centuries. The story that began with the signing of the Magna Carta was in fact sowing the seeds not only of that era, but also of the future. Who would have thought that this famous agreement between the barons and the king in 1215 would one day become a symbol of the struggle for freedom and justice all over the world? But the impact was not felt immediately. At first, Magna Carta seemed to be an achievement only for the powerful barons of England. However, over time, this humble document turned into a principle that proved that even kings were not above the law. Rule of law. Imagine that at that time the will of a king was seen as divine authority. Kings believed that they were exempt from the law and did not have to answer to anyone. But Magna Carta took the first step to shake this understanding to its foundations. The document clearly stated that no monarch could be above the law. Kings also had limits. They had to respect the rights of the barons. More importantly, over time, these rights turned into a guarantee that could be enjoyed not only by the nobility but also by the wider society. Thus, England was well on its way to establishing a balance mechanism against the arbitrary decisions of the king. One of the greatest impacts of the Magna Carta was that it laid the foundations for a constitutional monarchy. The document sparked a transformation that radically changed the way England was governed. At first, the barons were happy to gain power over the king, but over time, new mechanisms were needed to maintain this balance. This need paved the way for the birth of Parliament. The king now had to get parliamentary approval before taking major decisions, such as imposing taxes or declaring war. Gradually, the transition from absolute monarchy to constitutional monarchy began. Magna Carta was the document that laid the first stones of this long journey of transformation. Over time, the spirit of Magna Carta transcended the borders of England. From the American Declaration of Independence to the French Revolution, many freedom movements were inspired by this document. The principle of the rule of law spread the idea that kings and governments must respect the rights of the people. Magna Carta's influence shaped not only systems of government, but also notions of justice and human rights. Even today, many modern legal systems are based on the teachings of this document. The mind accordingly, the mind accordingly, the mind accordingly. But my friends, I cannot help asking, what was the real reason why the Magna Carta had such a lasting impact? How did this document, born out of the simple demands of barons, become a global symbol protecting the rights of the people? As we search for the answer to this question, we will look back through a magical mirror of history. Are you ready? Then our journey continues. Ah, my dear friends, we will return again to those distant times, to the windswept provincial lands of England. In the years that followed the Magna Carta, the balance of power in England had once again begun to shift. The victory of the barons over King John was not just a step that solved the political problems of the time. No, it was the beginning of a deeper and wider transformation. In the process, the barons broke the shackles of the old order and declared that power could no longer be concentrated in the hands of just one person. They argued that justice and governance should mean more than the whims of a king. In the years after 1215, Magna Carta's influence did not remain just a document. It was woven into the fabric of society. Barons were no longer merely subservient figures to the king. They began to transform into leaders, representing the people in their local areas. Instead of submitting directly to the king in matters such as collecting taxes or sending troops to war, they began to impose their own say. And this process was the precursor of the developments that planted the first seeds of parliamentary government in England. The spirit of Magna Carta, which limited the absolute powers of the king, began to be felt more concretely over time. Especially towards the middle of the 13th century, the barons came together to form a council that could advise the king. At first, these meetings were irregular, but over time they became more formalized. These assemblies were not only made up of barons, they also included nobles, church leaders, and even representatives of some towns. These were the first shoots of the modern parliamentary system. It was not yet a parliament, of course, but it was the first example of the idea that people could have a say in governance. These developments gave rise to new hopes among different segments of society in England. Imagine that once the people were oppressed under the absolute authority of the king. Now, however, a structure was emerging that was the voice of the people alongside the king. This was the beginning of a system that would protect the rights of the people and the nobles. In time, this assembly ceased to be a structure that only approved the king's demands. It became an institution that questioned the king's powers and supervised him. Thus, the balance of power between the king and the barons heralded a new order. However, the establishment of this new order was not easy. The alliance between the barons was not always solid. Conflicts of interest and remnants of the old order slowed down the process at times. On the other hand, some kings tried to undermine the powers of the parliament in order to get rid of the restrictions imposed by Magna Carta. This struggle showed that a longer period of time was needed for the parliamentary system to fully take shape. And now I ask you this question: would this fledgling conception of government one day become strong enough to take away all the powers of kings? How did Parliament pave the way that led England from absolute monarchy to constitutional monarchy? We will look for the answers to these questions together, so be patient and follow me. My friends, once again we return to the echoes of the famous Magna Carta. This time, however, we move away from the provincial landscapes of England and journey across centuries and continents to a wider stage: world history. Although Magna Carta was initially seen as the result of a reckoning only within England's own borders, over time its roots deepened and turned into a tree whose branches spread around the world. Perhaps the barons of the time did not even realize it, but this document would shape not only their own rights, but also the quest for freedom for generations to come. Imagine that this document, drafted in 13th century England, resonated across continents and literally laid the foundations of modern law. In fact, the principles of Magna Carta can be clearly seen in the Declaration of Independence of the United States of America in 1776. The American Declaration of Independence's statement that all men are created equal and are endowed with the inalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness embodies the spirit of Magna Carta. This document was one of the first stones that instilled the idea that governments cannot have unlimited power over the people. People living in the British colonies used Magna Carta's principle of justice as a shield against the arbitrary decisions of their rulers. This shield later became the basis of the U.S. Constitution, providing a solid foundation for the protection of individual rights. But this was not limited to America. Magna Carta's principle of the rule of law inspired many democratic systems around the world. In France, the influence of Magna Carta was felt in the drafting of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. This declaration, issued in 1789, paid homage to the philosophy of Magna Carta by emphasizing the fundamental rights of individuals and the limitation of state authority. In the same way, we can see the spirit of Magna Carta as one of the cornerstones of the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights. By making the inherent rights of every individual a universal principle, the document transformed the Magna Carta from a local treaty into a global legacy. Some of Magna Carta instilled in the world not only the rule of law, but also the idea that governments must be accountable. This was a sine qua non of a system in which the people could be heard. This understanding that a king or ruler cannot make arbitrary decisions in disregard of the rights of the people has resonated in many societies throughout the ages. The Magna Carta is therefore not just a document, but an ideal, a universal symbol of justice, freedom, and human dignity. And now, dear listeners, I would like to ask you this question. Does the inspiring impact of Magna Carta still resonate in today's world? Can modern societies continue to build a fairer future by preserving these deep-rooted principles? Let's discover the answers to these questions together. Ah, my dear friends, we have come to the end of another story. But you know that history never really ends. It moves forward in waves, flowing from one story to the next. Today we followed together the fascinating journey of the Magna Carta, from its first words carved in stone to the deepest corners of human history. This was not just the story of a document, but the echoes of a courageous step in the name of freedom, justice, and human dignity. We have witnessed this great legacy that history, like a river, carries with it as it flows, reaching the present day. And now I would like to ask you this. What do the lessons we have learned from the Magna Carta during this long journey mean for us today? What rights do we owe to this struggle? And most importantly, how will we carry this great legacy into the future? Remember that history does not only tell us about the past, it whispers to us how to shape our future. Each of us is a part of this great story, and every step we take, every line we write, touches the history of tomorrow. That is why it is incumbent on all of us to know and be inspired by the past. Dear viewers, today's journey ends here. But remember that history never ends. Every new day is the beginning of a new story. In our next meeting, we will travel to another corner of history, to another epic. So, which mysterious door do you think we should open? See you in the next story. Until then, may history be with you.